Today, we are exploring ancient heretical texts, evidence in the Bible and in history that show that the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is not who he says he is, that he's an entirely different being altogether and is just one of many gods. It's going to be really good. That's what we're talking about today, and we're going to get right into it. But as usual, please like and subscribe because my channel is about raising consciousness, and when you hit like, it spreads this information around. So please take a second to do it now. It helps out a lot. Also, big news, my new book, Neogenesis, Dawn of the New Mind, is out right now. It's on Amazon. Go check it out. Neogenesis, Dawn of the New Mind. Go take a look, and I appreciate reviews. All right, my friends, we are going to continue now, taking a look at these heretical texts, evidence in the Bible and throughout history that show that Yahweh is not who he says he is. So let's begin by taking a look at some of these heretical texts, and then we're going to explore some of the other areas as well that perhaps you're not too familiar with, because you may have seen some of my videos talking about how God is actually a war god, and he's even considered by some to be a storm god. Definitely not who he says that he is. So the ancient Gnostics were a group of heretical Christians that began to understand that, hey, look, the God, who is the, calls himself the creator God, is not that being whatsoever. So let's take a look at some of these texts, then we'll move on to evidence elsewhere throughout history dealing with the original Canaanite religion. So there's a heretical text called On the Origin of the World. And in this text, On the Origin of the World, that describes not only the creation of the world, but what happened before the creation of the world. We have this. And by the way, I want to remind you that you can always read all of these for free on gnosis.org. It's a great website and has all these texts for free. You can read them. He says, "It is I who am God, and there is no other that exists apart from me." And so you'll realize that God says this a lot in the Bible. In the Bible, God is constantly saying, I am the only God. I am the one true God. I am a jealous God. Thou shalt not have any gods but me. He says this a lot. So when the Gnostics are quoting God, this is scripture that, Christians would be familiar with, because you would find this in Christian scripture. So he says, it is who I am God. There is no other one that exists apart from me. But listen here. And when he said that, he sinned against all the immortal beings who give answer, and they laid it to his charge. So in this instance, when God says, I am the only God and there is no God but me, this text says that he sinned against all immortal beings. And I'll explain to you why in a minute. But first, there is another, let's see, where's it here? So this is another Gnostic text called The Reality of the Rulers, also known as the Hypostasis of the Archons. We're going to switch back and forth between some of these and compare. So On the Origin of the World describes the world's creation and what happened prior to the world's creation. The Reality of the Rulers, or also known as the Hypostasis of the Archons, describes the cosmic rulers of the world who trap souls and bodies here on earth. They call them archons. Archon means rulers. So the reality of the rulers, or the hypostasis of the archons, is all about talking about these archons, describing these archons. And the chief archon, the head archon, is the God of the Bible. And it says, quote, "Their chief is blind because of his power and his ignorance and his arrogance. He said, with his power, it is I who am God. There is none apart from me." Again, you'll notice the same thing. I am the only God. There is no other God but me. When he said this, he sinned against the entirety. And this speech got up to the incorruptibility. Then there was a voice that came forth from the incorruptibility saying, "You are mistaken, Samael," which is God of the blind. So you'll notice a parallel here. In reality of the rulers, he says, "It is I who am God, there is no God but me." And when he said this, he sinned against the entirety. On the Origin of the World, it says, "It is I who am God, and there is no other one that exists apart from me." And when he said this, he sinned against all the immortal beings. So what does this mean exactly? Well, it means that when he says, I am God and there is no other God but me, when it says he sinned against the entirety, that's because he is trying to deny the divinity of the rest of existence. And we are all divine. So this is essentially saying, hey, when the Creator God says, I am God and there is no God but me, he is the sinner. He is the one that is sinning against humanity and all reality. It's not that humanity sinned against God. It's that God is the original sinner. It wasn't, Adam and Eve who were the first sinners. God was the original sinner. When God said, I am the only God, there is no God but me, he sinned against the entirety. And it says when he said that, a voice came down from the incorruptibility. That is the realms of divine light, the higher realms, the powerful realms. Because remember, this being, which is Yahweh, according to the Gnostics, had many other names like Yaldabaoth, Samael, like we just heard, which means the blind god, Nebro, which means the rebel, and Saklis, which means the fool. He's the foolish one, the rebel, the blind one. And so he's a powerful being, but there are much more powerful beings of pure light known as eons. According to Gnosticism, Yaldabaoth, Yahweh is known as the dim ruler because he's a being of shadow and light. He's a being of shadow that has a piece of light within him that allows him to create. But he's essentially a being of shadow with a shard of light that allows him to do creation. And this being is much lesser than the other beings in existence. And so what we have here, let's continue. So now we know this aspect here, but what's really interesting about this is that we are all divine. So when God said, I am the only God, there is no God but me, he sinned against the entirety. He sinned against us. That's what that means. He sinned against us. And so God was actually terrified of humanity. God was terrified of human beings. He was terrified of Adam. Why? Because human beings, now I'm not talking about when they're trapped in bodies, but the true human being is a God that is more powerful than the God of the Bible, than the God of Christianity, than the Creator God, the blind God, because humanity is from the realms of divine light. And this is why, according to the Gnostics, that God wanted to trap human souls in bodies because he was afraid of them. And he wanted to trap them in bodies and wipe their memories so they would forget what they are. And that's the whole thing. That's the whole point of Gnosticism, is saying that God is terrified of us. That's why he traps us in bodies, wipes our memories, and is constantly waging a war against humanity, trying to get them to forget what they are. Now, this is according to the Gnostics. We're going to look at other things in a minute, but so let's take a look at this. This is again from On the Origin of the World. It says, and before Adam of light had withdrawn in the chaos. So what are they talking about here when they say Adam of light? They're talking about the human being, and this is before the human being was trapped in the material world, before the human being was trapped in bodies. Before Adam of light had withdrawn in the chaos, the authorities saw him. Who are the authorities? The archons. That's what the authorities mean. The archons, the rulers. So Adam, they saw Adam. And when they saw Adam, they laughed at the prime parent. Who's the prime parent? The chief archon, the creator of the world, the God of the Bible. So why did they laugh when they saw Adam? All the authorities, all the archons, laughed at the chief archon, laughed at God when they saw Adam. Why? Because he had lied when he said, it is I who am God and no one exists but me. When the archons came to him, they said, is this not the God who ruined our work? So basically, what's happening here is that they saw Adam. Basically, Adam was in the material world for a bit, not in a body, but he was in that realm. They saw him. Then Adam went back to the realm of light. And so they saw Adam as this being of light, and they laughed at God. The archons laughed at God because God had says it's no God, there is no God but me. And they said, well, hey, you're a liar because this God just ruined our work. So basically, Adam, this is saying that Adam is a God and a more powerful God than the God of the Bible. And on the origin of the world gets into this in even greater detail. It talks about how Adam creates all these different heavens and domains and dimensions, and they're all better than what the Creator God created. So God is both terrified of this being and also hates this being because it's making him look bad and ruining his creation. And so the archons laugh at God and said, hey, you said there is no God but you, but is this not the God who ruined our work? And he answered them, God answered them, the archons, the chief archon, God answered him and said, yes, he is. If you do not want him to be able to ruin our work, come, let us create a man out of earth according to the image of our body and according to the likeness of this being to serve us, so that when he sees his likeness, he might become enamored of it. No longer will he ruin our work. Rather, we shall make those who are born out of the light our servants for all the duration of this eternal realm. So the archons see Adam. They laugh at God and said, hey, this God's more powerful and he's ruining our work. You said you were the only true God. What the hell? And God says, yeah, you're right. So what we need to do is trap Adam in a material body and all beings of light into material bodies so that the light will be our servants. See, these dark rulers, the darkness is trying to get light to be their servant. How? By trapping them in bodies, which according to the Gnostics are creations of darkness. They looked at bodies as being prisons. So basically, God is like, hey, let's make bodies, trap Adam in a body, get him to forget what he is, become wrapped up in this dream, and serve us. And you might be thinking, well, how is that possible? Well, think about it. When you go to sleep and dream, you don't realize you're dreaming. You just go along with the narrative. You don't remember everything going on in your life, or you believe everything that's happening in that dream narrative. You just fall into the story. So Yaldabaoth is trying to do this same sort of thing. Weave this dream reality, this dream world, and trap Adam in a body, and then other beings of light in bodies to be their servant, to be his servant and the rest of the archon's servant. And so this is what the Gnostics believe. And the whole point of Gnosticism was to get people to realize that they are divine, achieve gnosis, so that they can begin to defeat the archons and escape the material world, because according to them, we're trapped in the cycle of reincarnation. Okay? So what I want to do now, okay, is take a look, because that's what the Gnostics believe. So we're also going to take a look at an article here. I'm going to read some excerpts from this article. This is an article on medium.com called Evolution of the Christian God. All right. It's by Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table. That's the name of the author, Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table. If you like this article, go give them a follow over on medium.com. I'm just going to read a few little excerpts here and there. So if you want to read the whole thing, you can on medium.com. But this is called Evolution of the Christian God, how this tribal storm god evolved over time. So we saw that the Gnostics looked at this God and was like, hey, this is not God. This is an evil being. This is the fool, the rebel, the blind God, not the true God. We're the true God, not this thing. But if we take a look at it now, not from the lens of Gnosticism, but from a historical context, we see something very similar. See, the Gnostics were onto something. Remember, Gnosticism is just a story. It's not literally true. But the Gnostics were highly intuitive. And they were understanding something. And what they were understanding is that this being is not a good being and not the only being. And so now if we take a look at history, we'll see that history confirms that in where Yahweh originated from was not a system of monotheism. In other words, it has its roots in the ancient Canaanite religion, which is a polytheism. There are multiple gods. In here, Yahweh is just one of many different deities, like El Elyon and Asherah and Baal and many others. And so this is kind of like the Greek pantheon, where you have Zeus and Poseidon and all the different deities, and some people might worship one god, some people might worship the other, but there's a bunch of different ones. That's where Yahweh originated from, in ancient religion where there were multiple gods. He was just one of them. This slowly morphed over time into a henotheism, where Yahweh started to be seen as the most powerful God and started to absorb the attributes of some of the other gods. And eventually this became a monotheism at that point, where he absorbed the qualities of the other gods, and then he was considered the only God. But that's not all the case. It started as a polytheism with multiple gods, then evolved into a henotheism with multiple gods, but Yahweh is the most powerful, and then a monotheism like we have in modern Christianity, which says that he is the only God. But we're going to see that that's not the case. He was just one of many gods. He was a war god or a storm god. And this is why we have so much atrocities in the Bible. And by the way, if you look in the Bible, God often represents himself as a storm or a cloud. And when you start seeing all the terrible things that happen in the Bible in the name of this God, all the sacrifice to this God, animal sacrifice, human sacrifice in the case of Jephthah's daughter, all the orders of massacre that this God gave and committed, that doesn't make any sense if you think it's a God of love. But if you realize, oh, this is a war God, well, that makes a lot of sense. This is a bloodthirsty war being that you would give offerings to when you wanted to be successful in battle and destroy your enemies. It's not a God of love. It's not a good God. So let's take a look at this. So once again, this is some excerpts from Religion and Politics at the Dinner Table. It says, you always hear Christians prop up their God as the one true God. They look at other religions and their God or gods as being misled and false. Christians credit their God as being omnipotent, omniscient, and the only one in existence, often attributing the possibility of any other deities as being demons who actually are fallen angels that serve the devil. They also claim that their God has always existed and has never changed. So, okay, this is really interesting, by the way, because for those who don't know, I grew up in a strict Christian household. I was a Christian for many years. I used to be a Christian for a long time. I was a very devout Christian, very passionate Christian, and I'm very familiar with all this stuff. So here's the interesting idea. First, one thing that I want to point out that's just kind of cool. The author here says Christians credit their God as being omnipotent, omniscient, and the only one in existence. Like, all powerful and all knowing, right? I just want to point out that the Gnostics were very smart. This is kind of unrelated, but the Gnostics were really smart because listen to this in the Testimony of Truth. This comes from the Testimony of Truth, a Gnostic text. And it says, where is it? But what sort of God is this? That's what they say. First, he maliciously refused Adam from eating from the tree of knowledge. They say, okay, what kind of God? They're saying, like, what kind of God is this? What the hell? What's going on here? First, he refused Adam from eating from the tree of knowledge. Sounds kind of messed up. Second, he said, Adam, where are you? If you read the Bible, you'll see that in Genesis, God is looking for Adam. Adam, where are you? And then it says, God does not have foreknowledge. Basically, if God knows everything, why doesn't God know where Adam is? It says, quote, would he not know him? Quote, would he not know from the beginning? And afterwards he says, let us cast him out of this place, lest he eat of the tree of life and live forever. Surely he has shown himself to be a malicious grudger And it continues and continues. Basically, they're saying, look, this is not an all-powerful, all-knowing God. Not at all. Anyway, I digress. I just think it's interesting how, intelligent the Gnostics were. But anyway, the author says that Christians believe their God is omnipotent, knows everything, is all-powerful, and is all-loving. And the only God in existence. And it says they often attribute the possibility of any other deities as being demons who actually are fallen angels that serve the devil. And that's really true. That's right. So in the Bible, it mentions other gods. There are other gods mentioned in the Bible. There's mention of, different tribes worshiping these different gods, worshiping these different deities. That's why God even says, I am a jealous God, thou shalt have no other God but me. And by the way, I tried to find this quote. If one of you out there knows where it is, I remember in one of the Gnostic texts, I'm pretty darn sure, I just can't find it. I'm pretty sure it's in there. God says, I am the only God, there is no God but me. I am a jealous God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, but in one way or another, the text says something like, well, he just gave himself away because if he was the only God, he wouldn't have anything to be jealous of. So clearly there's other gods. I'm pretty sure that was if one of you knows where that is, let me know. Maybe it was something else, but I'm pretty sure it was a Gnostic text. I wanted to find that quote for today's stream. I just couldn't find it. But anyway, yeah, that there are other gods in the Bible. And I remember, as a young child thinking that's weird. Why are there other gods in the Bible? And yeah, I was always told, well, these are demons. They're not, they're demons pretending to be gods, basically, was the answer. But of course, that's twisting the narrative here. The author says, now let's look at the historical evidence for this character, Yahweh, so that we can now see how he has evolved over time. Now, I just want to make it clear for those who are watching, I'm kind of going back and forth between multiple perspectives. And so that can muddy things a little bit, but I just want to be clear for those who might be familiar with this stuff. I'm talking about when we began, I talked about the Gnostic interpretation of the creator God as being an evil being and not the only God. That's what we talked about. Now we're switching lanes a little bit and looking at it from a different lens, and that is the history of Yahweh. We're looking at a historical perspective, no longer Gnostic stories and their interpretation, but a historical understanding of the evolution of this entity Yahweh. Now let's look at the historical evidence for this character Yahweh, and character is a better word than entity, so that we can see how he has evolved over time. If you look into the history of this character, you'll see that he dates back to the early Iron Age or late Bronze Age, so around 2,000 or 4,000 years ago. Back then, though, he was not the all-powerful God of the Christians that we know today. Back in that day, he was slumming it as a tribal war god of the Canaanites. Okay, so that's critical to understand here. If we take a look from a historical perspective, is Yahweh a character that exists? Yes, but much different from how he is understood today. He was a tribal war god of the Canaanites, one of many. Like the Greek pantheon is a good example. There were different deities, and you'd call upon different deities and worship different deities, and they all did different things. Yahweh was a war god, just like Ares. Not exactly, but you get the idea here. There's just one of many. Quote, he was part of a pantheon of gods, many gods, such as El, I mentioned that earlier, El Elyon, or El the Most High God, Baal, Asherah, and Anat. Baal and Asherah are both mentioned in the Old Testament, and Asherah and El have roots in Sumerian mythology, predating any of this by a couple of millennia. So we have Yahweh, who was around 2,000 or 4,000 years ago as a tribal god of the Canaanites, but he was just one of many gods. And Asherah and El are much older, having roots in Sumerian mythology. And this is a quote from 1 Kings 18:19. Now then, send orders and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So it was verses like this that in the Bible, I remember growing up and being like, why are there other gods? Isn't there only supposed to be one God? And so the answer was always, oh, well, they were demons. They were demons pretending to be gods. But that's very much twisting the narrative. Yeah, okay, so the author continues, and this is interesting, similar. The author says, when I went to church, I always understood this verse as these priests just worshiping some false gods, demons, basically, or various incarnations of the devil. Yeah, I had the same experience. I was taught, well, these are just demons or servants of Satan, not gods. But the reality is that early Israelites had chosen their particular patron deity and were just shunning others, all of which had come from the same pantheon. So this would be like if you lived in ancient Greece and liked worshiping Zeus rather than Poseidon, etc. People had their rival teams since the beginning, it seems. So you had people, a group, let me make sure that my microphone is actually still on because I just bumped it. Yes, we're good. So you had a group of people that would worship Baal. You had other groups of people who would worship Asherah. The Israelites chose Yahweh and decided to shun all the other gods. But this would be no different from like living in ancient Greece, like the author says, and being like, you know what? I'm going to worship Poseidon. And so imagine that. Poseidon. Let's take Poseidon for example. Poseidon is one of many gods. Yahweh was one of many gods. It's a polytheism. And the Israelites were like, hey, you know what? We're going to make Yahweh our exclusive God. And so this then became a henotheism, which means there are many gods, but one is the best. So that would be like going, you know what? Let's say that Poseidon is the best god, the strongest god, the most powerful god. And then, though, this went even further and morphed into a monotheism where Yahweh absorbed the characteristics of other gods like El and absorbed those characteristics and became the only God. And this would be like taking Poseidon and giving Poseidon the attributes of Zeus and some of the other gods, and then being like, you know what? Poseidon's actually the only God, the one true God. There is no other God except Poseidon, and giving Poseidon all these different attributes. This is what has happened with Yahweh, who was a war god. So the author says the reason that the Israelites were against the Canaanites is because they had adopted one of their gods and decided they wanted to reject some of the others. Israelites had multiple gods at this point, but they decided they really liked Yahweh. Yahweh had just been a warrior storm god, but the Israelites decided to elevate him to the national god of Israel. You see how this is all transforming and morphing into what we have today? And in Christianity, it's morphed even further, where you have Jesus Christ as God, but then Jesus Christ absorbs the qualities of Yahweh, who had absorbed the quality of the other gods, because Jesus and Yahweh are considered to be the same, according to Christianity. Jesus and Yahweh are the same. And that's a big problem that Christians have to explain, by the way. It's like, well, why is Yahweh such this horrible, terrible God that's destroying everything? And Jesus is all about love and forgiveness. They seem like completely different beings. And Christians have a really hard time explaining this. And because, sometimes you'll go, well, God did all these terrible things. And they'll be like, oh, well, that's just the Old Testament. Jesus is all about love. Well, yeah, but according to you, Jesus and God are the same thing. So Jesus did all that. Essentially, Jesus was there from the beginning and is the same being as God. That's according to Christianity. So you have this evolution of Yahweh being part of a polytheism. They choosing Yahweh as being the best one, and then making Yahweh the only one. Then Jesus comes around, who is also Yahweh, but not, but is. And it's quite a muddied mess. And this is why you have the Gnostics, the Marcionites, and the Cathars, who all went, hey, Jesus is great. We all love Jesus. Yahweh? He sucks. Yahweh's a piece of shit. That's essentially what the Cathars, the Marcionites, and the Gnostics all said. They were all very pro-Jesus because Jesus says some pretty great things. I used to hate Jesus, but that's because I just understood the Christian interpretation of Jesus. But if you actually look at what Jesus says and what Jesus preached and Jesus taught, he was pretty great. I don't agree with everything Jesus said, but some of the things are really good. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Some really, really good stuff, especially in the Gnostic Gospels. There's some really good stuff as well, talking about how you are divine, we're all divine, etc. But Yahweh, no, Yahweh's not a good God. And so, and Marcion was the creator of the world's first Christian canon. In other words, you could say the first Bible, the first Christian canon. And this canon, this collection of texts, it was like the first Bible, but the first Christian canon that Marcion created, excluded the Old Testament and only had the New Testament. Not the entire New Testament, but some of the Gospels and some of the writings of the apostles. And Marcion did this because he's like, hey, the Old Testament is all about an evil God and has nothing to do with Jesus. The Cathars thought that the Old Testament was written by Satan, inspired by Satan to fool humanity into thinking he was God, because they believed that Satan was God and God was Satan, the creator of this world. And so they were like, the Old Testament is an evil being, and created these texts to fool people. But let's see, I digress. They eventually decided, this is what the author says, they eventually decided they really liked a few of the gods, but they were going to elevate Yahweh above the rest. They kept Asherah around, but rather than being the wife of Anu from the Sumerian mythology, she was now Yahweh's wife. Yes, the Old Testament God had a wife. So they said, okay, Yahweh's the best. The Israelites said, okay, Yahweh's the best. We like Yahweh, but we also like some of these other gods. So Yahweh's better than these other gods, but these other gods still exist. So this is where you go from a polytheism to a henotheism. There are other gods, but there is one God who is the best God, the most powerful God. And Asherah was originally the wife of Anu from Sumerian mythology, but she became Yahweh's wife. Eventually, this evolved. And they transformed, this is what the author says, this once tribal war deity into not just the most powerful God, but as being the only God. They developed the concept of one God and monotheism as a central tenet of their religion. This character, Yahweh, once a member of a pantheon and associated with wars and storms, is now the central figure of two of the largest religions on earth. So let's see here. There's a couple of other things that I want to note. It says early Christian Gnosticism focused heavily on the concept of spirituality being more holy than and the physical world being inherently evil. Even seeing Yahweh, who they refer to as Yaldabaoth or the demiurge, that's another word that they call him, demiurge or demiurgos, which means creator. They had a lot of names for him. Yaldabaoth, demiurgos, like I mentioned them earlier, Samael, and Nebro and Saklas, fool, rebel, blind. They didn't like him very much. They hated him. So they saw Yahweh, who they refer to as Yaldabaoth or the demiurge, as being an imperfect, evil creator God and not the true God. Eventually, of course, the majority of Christians adopted Yahweh as being the one true God. They developed the concept of the Trinity to elevate Jesus to the same level as God the Father. So there you have it, from a rather obscure member of a pantheon for one group of people out in the Middle East, all the way to the primary God of three different modern day religions that billions of the world's populations are followers of. And this next point that the author makes is really important. It amazes me that this character is said to be this all-loving, perfect being and the only true God, when all it takes is looking at history and what evidence we have in front of us to see that this character evolved over time and was influenced by the circumstances of the people writing the stories. Judaism and then Christianity adopted various different ideas and assimilated them into their religion. And then, unlike Judaism, they thrust that religion onto anyone they came across. And he goes on to say that the reason why this religion has spread is not because of the truth, but because of how militantly they have both been spread, by assimilating and erasing other religions and cultures as they've spread. That's what the author says here. So the important part, I want to read this part again. It amazes me that this character is said to be the all-perfect, all-powerful being and the only true God, when all it takes is looking at history and what evidence we have in front of us. And it's absolutely true. All we have to do, and it makes more sense. Now it's like, okay, this is why there are all these different gods in the Bible. This is why God is constantly unaliving tons of people, innocent people, men, women, children, allowing SA to occur. There are so many things that happen in the Bible that I can't talk about because they are so atrocious. Accepting a burnt virgin sacrifice because he allowed one of his servants to be successful in battle. That was the offering to him for being successful in battle. Clearly a war god. None of this makes sense when you understand it from the traditional Christian narrative. But when you look at it from a historical perspective, it makes perfect sense. And the Gnostics, they didn't have, what the Gnostics basically did, they came at it from a different angle. They basically came at it from using logic and reason, rather than being like, oh, well, this evolved over time. First he was a storm god, blah, 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 blah. What the Gnostics did, they had a different approach. They were like, hey, if we just look at what this being does and use reason, we can figure out that this is not an all-loving, all-powerful God. That's why in the testimony of truth, it says, why did he ask where Adam is? If he's all-knowing, shouldn't he know that? Why is he a malicious grudger? Why does he deny Adam knowledge? What kind of God is this? There's another one where it says, and he said, I am a jealous God. I will bring the sins of the father upon the children until 3 and 4 generations. And he said, I will make their heart thick and I will cause their mind to become blind that they might not comprehend the things that are said. So he's saying, I'm a jealous God and I'm going to make, basically, if the father sins, right? If some guy sins, I'm going to make the children for 3 and 4 generations pay for it. How screwed up is that? 4 generations of children, offspring, being punished for something their dad did, or great-great-great-great-grandfather did. And the testimony of truth says, but these things he has said to those who believe in him and serve him. So it's saying, like, look, God isn't even saying this about his enemies. He's saying this to his servants. He's saying this to those who worship him. And yeah, if you read stories in the Bible, he often treats people that worship him very poorly. Particularly in the story of Job, where God just decides, hey, you know what? Satan basically goes to God and says, hey, look at this guy, Job. And God goes, yeah, I know Job. Job's one of my best servants. He's one of my most faithful servants. And Satan goes, hey, nah, he's just a servant of yours because you give him a good life. If you didn't give him a good life, he wouldn't serve you anymore. So God said, bet, I'm going to F him up. And so God let Satan basically destroy this guy's life, made him incredibly sick. All his family died, his wife and his children killed, lost all his money, everything. Got so sick, it was like being tortured. All these horrible things happened to him. And then at the end, and then it's like, well, do you still believe in God? Do you still worship God? And Job was like, yes, I do. And God was like, see, I told you, Satan was right. and so then, to be fair, God then heals him from his sickness, gives him new animals and wealth, a new wife, and new kids. But how effed up is that story? That doesn't, first of all, you're torturing a guy for no reason whatsoever. Not even just any person, but your most faithful servant you're torturing. You killed his whole family, or let his family be killed. And then, yeah, I grew up in a Christian household, so I was like, hey, this story seems kind of weird. And the answer is, oh, but look, but God blessed him afterwards and gave him a new family and new kids. And that's horrible. Do you really think that's, how would you feel if someone unalived your spouse and your children, who you loved dearly, and then was like, but it's okay, here's a new wife and new kids? No, how screwed up is this? And for no reason at all, other than just to see like, hey, I wonder what would happen if I did this. Anyway, sorry, I am, sometimes this triggers me because I have RTS, religious trauma syndrome, because I grew up in a religious household. So hearing these stories can be frustrating and emotionally driving. So anyway, I hope that it is clear that Yahweh, by any stretch of the imagination, is not a God of love. Clearly, whether you look at it like the Gnostics did and just say, look, using logic and reason, we can see that this being is a sicko, or by looking at history and being like, oh, he was just one of many gods, and then, stories evolved over time, and through the evolution of religion, he ended up becoming a war god. A war god ended up becoming the one true God. And yeah, that makes a lot more sense now when you look at the Bible. So this is not a God of love. This is not a good God. This is not a God that one wants to look at as the being that is the all-loving, worshipful creator. Absolutely not. And this goes to show why we have so many problems in the world. When this being, when a war god, like, look around you, and doesn't the world make a lot more sense? When billions of people worship a war god, doesn't it make a lot more sense the way the world is today? So this is why we need to transform the world. We cannot have a new world until we have a new consciousness. Everything begins as an idea in the mind. And if your idea is war, you're gonna get war. But if your idea is connection, creativity, and wisdom, you're gonna have a beautiful world. Everyone wants to escape this world. Yeah, because it's a trashy place. It doesn't have to be. Like Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom is within you and all around you. We have the power to build the kingdom right here and right now through a new consciousness within you and around you. What is inside becomes like what is outside. What is outside becomes like what is inside. So we have the power to do that. We have the power to transform that. And it's time we start doing it right now. Because we are our own saviors. No one's coming to save us, let alone some war god. Absolutely not. So my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. I have a lot more. Go check them out. As always, please like and subscribe, because when you hit like and subscribe, it spreads this information. It is important to get this information out there. Also, please follow me on Spotify, Dawn of the New Earth. That also helps spread this information on other platforms. And check out my new book. It is out right now on Amazon. Neogenesis, Dawn of the New Mind. Go check it out. And it is one of 5 books that I am releasing this year, all on the Neogenian system. Neogenian meaning new beginning, It's time for a new beginning right now. And that's what we are. So my friends, so nice to see you. Thank you for being here. If you'd like to support my work at patreon.com/MorgueOfficial, we're having a members only stream. It's going to be great. I want to give a shout out to everyone who supports, especially Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Angela, the Halloween Mom, DB, Nusalina, Eric, Christopher, Joel, Phillips, Luke, Thomas, Ryan, Eon, and everyone else. Thank you very much.